And we can't think about relationships in the modern context without thinking of the social and material changes that we're going through.
You're listening to Good is in the Details. I'm Gwendolyn Dolske.
And I'm Rudy Salo.
And this is the podcast where we learn what we didn't know in the spirit of Socrates, all with the aim of a good life. Today we're going to be talking about romantic agency. What does that mean? What is romance? What does agency mean? We have philosophy professor Luke Brunning to give us all the details on philosophy of love and romance.
Yes, and this is one of those episodes where, when you talk about love and romantic things, you naturally should take the lead there because you have a lot to say on it. And I was certainly more of a listener, but I did like that we did take this discussion. I mean, something that's really important to people throughout the world, and especially where we live in California and the United States, affordable housing, and how the family unit, the restructuring of the family unit, the restructuring of a home, what does it mean to have a home, and ADUs and junior ADUs, that actually becomes relevant in this discussion. So even for those who are extremely satisfied and comfortable with those romantic life, you should listen to this discussion because we talk about the implications for it for all of our fellow Americans and how we live.
Yeah, I think ever since I've been learning more about what philosophy has to offer when it comes to discussions about love and romance, it has really surprised me about how our laws and our culture are reflecting ideas about who you can love, when you can love, how you can love. And so when we are talking about love with a philosophical lens, it's not just for the poets. It really is a discussion about how we're navigating and flourishing in society through these relationships. And then also what is allowed by the law. And then, it comes up to the practical stuff like mortgages and housing when we're talking about family units. And then the family unit reflects our concepts of love and what is allowed. So Luke did a fabulous job giving us the breakdown about his book on romantic agency. We're going to link it in the show notes. And also, dear listeners, remember to check out our Patreon, patreon.com. We've got some cool stuff for podcasters in our shop there. And yeah, you can get a shout out from us when you sign up for our Patreon. Okay, let's talk about romantic agency with Professor Luke Brunning. Luke, what about Love Actually? Here, we'll just get started.
Okay, I've seen that one.
You've seen Love Actually. Okay,
Yeah.
So as somebody who goes into studying philosophy and philosophy of love and you write a book on romantic agency. Luke, what are your thoughts about Love Actually?
I mean, it's a classic and it's a really interesting portrayal of a lot of our kind of social norms and ideals about love, but also one that kind of throws them open to kind of ridicule, I think. I'm not sure how much of good sense there is to say about it and what kind of level of analysis we should take with it, but it's certainly an odd film to look back on. I mean, I have this kind of vague memory of watching it when I was younger and sort of thinking, oh, it's this kind of like classic Christmas film. It's a kind of feel-good film. And then sort of watching it every year, you think this is quite a silly film, really, isn't it? Like the some of the portrayals of even some of the kind of apparently sweeter kind of relationships are quite problematic, I think. Colin Firth character, I can't remember his name, but this kind of attempt to be emotionally sincere, and you actually look at the dynamic there and you realize he's kind of not really being very communicative. He's being quite horrible. Like it's not really eliciting people's kind of consent, not really asking them how they're feeling. And that's meant to be this amazing romantic kind of climax, and one that I think more than once has made me shed a tear as well, even though I know that it's kind of silly. So yeah, it's a kind of weird film. It's one that I think a lot of people like to watch, but ultimately don't really identify with many of the characters at all when we actually sort of sit and think about it in the light of day.
I remember when I saw it in the theater, and that's actually when I was living in Belgium, and I just kind of shrunk in my seat when they did the portrayal of the American president. And I thought, oh my God, it's so, as a foreigner in a foreign place, and then seeing how your political representative is being portrayed in a fictional way, I was just like, oh my goodness. I mean, it would be one thing if I saw it at home while I was in the States, but to see it in another country, oh my goodness.
Yeah, I think it's one of these films where it kind of all blurs together with a lot of other romantic comedies. It's quite hard to keep them distinct in your mind, right? But looking back at a lot of them as well, you realize that the things that were considered uncool, or the kind of types of like body type or appearance that were kind of ridiculed or seen as kind of emblematic of failure, are just incredibly sort of ordinary or extraordinary people, right? And like our beauty norms and our norms of kind of professional success are really skewed. I mean, I remember watching Bridget Jones's Diary for the first time recently, and the idea of being a kind of a single woman owning her own flat in publishing, a successful career, and this is kind of portrayed as kind of pathetic. And I'm thinking that's an amazing career that most people can't sustain anymore at all. I mean, these films are kind of like, they do really expose our kind of ideals of happiness, of success, of flourishing in ways that are quite useful to think about sometimes. You got to interrogate how we react to them as well. Like the things we find moving, the things we find funny are often things that we would hate if they happened to us, or we wouldn't find particularly amusing.
Well, let's get into your book, Romantic Agency. And I want to start out with a basic thing, since philosophers love talking about terms. What do we mean by romantic? Like, what is the distinguishing factor of a romantic relationship? And then what is meant by agency?
Okay, so that first question, perhaps you go in with like one of the hardest questions that I've been asked multiple times in different contexts, right? What's the difference between a kind of romantic intimacy and some other kind of intimacy, like a friendship? In the book, at least, I kind of take quite a sort of relatively non-committal answer. So I think that there's one way we might try and answer this question, which is to identify a kind of distinct feature or factor which makes the difference. So for some people, it might be having sex. For other people, it might be sharing life projects, living together. For other people, it might be sharing values or goals or desires or something like that. These are the things that distinguish a kind of romantic from a non-romantic relationship. I think that project, and it's one I've tried to kind of think about in the past, like it's sort of doomed to fail, right? Because each feature you pick out, there's a counterexample. So you'll have a romantic relationship that doesn't seem to involve sex, or where the people don't live together, or where they're very different from each other, or where they don't have the same values. Likewise, you might have friends who maybe have sex together or live together or whatever. So trying to kind of come up with a distinct differentiating feature is quite challenging. The way I think about it is a kind of group of overlapping features in different social contexts. Kind of typical romantic relationships will kind of share lots of those features. One of them, I think, is a kind of, I'm trying to find a non-fancy word for it, but a kind of like bodily proximity, sort of being around somebody in a physical way quite a lot of the time. And that's very, very vague. And you might say, well, actually, that's not useful either, because that actually is very similar with kind of raising children, for example. But I think there is something that maybe separates romantic relationships from kind of close friendships, is just the kind of rubbing up against each other in space for a long time. Even that maybe doesn't make the difference. And so what I ultimately suggest is that romantic relationships are kind of the things that people label romantic relationships. And that's not very helpful.
It's a head scratcher. Luke, this is, if you don't mind, I don't know if you've ever told your students the famous question of what is a chair? And then all the students go around and they're having a difficult time, from Plato. And I one time switched it up and I asked my class, what is a cookie? It was a 45-minute debate with no resolution. And
that's metaphysics, right?
Yes.
In fact, you can do a lot. I used to do the same thing when I was, we used to do it with me and my friends, ask like, what's the pie? Define a pie or define a sandwich, right? And you can do this all day and trying to find that feature.
That's what your book was kind of doing to me when it was, because at first I thought romantic agency and I was like, okay, this is great. And then when I started to really chew on it, what constitutes a romantic relationship? Because if we say marriage, that's not it, because you can imagine two people who are married just for financial purposes. There's no romance there. If we say it is for sex, then we can imagine two people having sex and there's no romantic involvement there. And then we can imagine all of these things that don't constitute romantic. Every time I try to define it, I can think of a relationship other than a romantic one that it fits. I didn't realize this was so complicated. But if we say it's just what you label, then does that mean it's subjective? So then...
Well, I think it's different. So the way I think about it is that, in different social contexts, there are all these kind of social meanings flying around. We find ourselves kind of situated within those meanings, whether we like it or not, right? So I think this is one of the things about so-called romantic intimacy, is that a lot of people want to resist that. They want to say, well, I'm not in a romantic relationship, or this isn't romantic. But they'll find themselves running up against social kind of resistance to that. Other people will view them and treat them as if they're in a kind of romantic intimacy. And it's that kind of package of treatment and kind of social posturing that I think can kind of bring things into being that make these distinctions have a kind of social weight to them, irrespective of what we think about it, right? I might have a very idiosyncratic sense of what it is to be romantic or what a kind of intimacy is like. But if everyone else around me says, well, that kind of thing you've got going on with that person looks pretty romantic to me. You live together, you sleep together, you have kids together, I'm going to be treated by society in that way. I think, other philosophers give similar kinds of attempts to analyze things like gender or other social roles in a similar way, right? That if you present yourself in a certain way, other people will read you in that way, irrespective of how you feel about it subjectively. And there's a kind of weight to those readings. They affect how you're going to be treated. So that's kind of one way maybe to think about what it is to be romantic. Other people might try and flesh that out a bit more by thinking about kind of narrative structure or like a kind of romantic trajectory or certain kinds of action and behavior, kind of certain forms of sort of seduction or being implicit or trying to kind of convince people to be with you in a certain kind of way. But I think ultimately, as with the question about, defining a chair, right? Like one thing we can do, and one thing that some philosophers like to do is just pause the questioning and say, well, hang on a minute, what's the purpose of this? Like, does it matter? Why do you need this information? And I think that's where things get interesting around romantic life, because often people want to draw these distinctions because there's some practical payoff, right? Like some people get tax benefits, some people aren't. Some people are going to be morally praised, others condemned. Some people are going to receive my support, some people won't. Some people can visit me when I'm in hospital, some people can't. So like there are these kind of interesting downstream practical questions that might come of this. And then when we start looking at those, we start thinking, well, maybe our kind of intuitive distinctions between the romantic and non-romantic kind of don't really hold water. And we see this around committed relationships or notions of marriage and the way that the state tries to recognize these things. And it doesn't do a very good job of tracking people's actual kind of intimacies. So again, in the book, I think I have a cop out where I'm sort of saying, well, it's really hard to pin down this distinction. And I think I also say in one paragraph that, look, the book could have been called something like, intimate agency, right? It's a slightly broader notion. It's more encompassing. But I do think there's a range of social meanings attached to the notion of romantic, which aren't attached to friendship, which aren't attached to parenting and other kinds of caring, which give it a kind of weight. So people make assumptions about sexuality or about commitment or about value, desire, when they think that something's romantic, than they don't when they think it's a friendship. And they do that even if you don't want them to make those assumptions. And one way that this kind of started to, I started to think about this was just looking at people who have kind of maybe socially unconventional relationships. So I was really interested in thinking about and talking to asexual people who have romantic relationships and romantic partners. They may not be, sexually active, or they may not have much sex. They may not be very sensual. And I think that really puts pressure on this idea that romance is kind of friendship plus sex, because you talk to an asexual person in a romantic relationship and they'll say, no, it's different from my friendships. There's something about it that's different. Defining that is challenging, right? But I kind of really wanted to run with that and say, yeah, there is something different. It might be just that there's a kind of a range of overlapping things, some of which will be shared with friendship, others which will be shared with parenting and caring and so on. So these questions are interesting, but they do kind of raise these more practical, pragmatic considerations like, why does it matter? And trying to identify that question is often helpful when doing the kind of metaphysical stuff as well.
I can see how it would matter. I know that there was a lot of discussion about in your book about non-monogamous relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And it is not just a question about curiosity or doing things your way or that. It's more than that because of the ramifications when it comes to law, when it comes to legal status, when it comes to even, like you said, social situations, because we want to enjoy our lives, we want to be happy. But there are these cultural norms that if you stray outside of a given trajectory, people will make you feel bad. And then maybe you will feel some sort of shame, or maybe you have shame because you're not expressing things. So when it comes to non-monogamous relationships, I'm wondering, what is the cultural tone in Leeds or in the UK as opposed to the United States? Because the United States, it really depends on where you are if you're in a bigger city. But I know that a lot of the United States is extremely conservative and it would be very difficult for somebody to openly be in an ethically non-monogamous relationship. Or what are your findings about the cultural attitudes?
It's a tricky one. So the UK is a good example of how these questions, these kind of metaphysical questions and questions of social meaning have real impact. So, in the UK, for example, there's an attempt by politicians of both main parties to kind of weaponize ideas of gender and to kind of create a moral panic around transgender individuals. And that's a really interesting example of how these things have a real practical impact on people's lives, right? These questions about social meaning and experience, subjective experience, and our emotional lives. I think it's a little harder to get a read on kind of social attitudes towards non-monogamy. I think it's definitely something that's growing in the public kind of imagination as maybe something on the fringes. I don't think there's a kind of well-developed kind of moral opposition to it, but I also don't think that the UK is a particularly liberal, socially liberal country either. I think there's a lot of kind of small c conservatism and concern about the unconventional. Lots of people are just not particularly open to imagining alternatives. They're not really embracing these kind of possibilities of experiments and living. And they're not particularly interested in the social benefits of sort of allowing other people to explore things. It's
What
hard
are
to
the
really
social
say.
benefits? I would love to know, in your opinion, what are the social benefits? Because when you say, okay, well, why do we care about these things? I think it would be really interesting to know, why do people care if somebody is outside of a monogamous relationship? And I also want to ask one other thing. Do you think the fact that we live longer has any impact on this? Because
Oh yeah,
a lot of people
definitely.
have a couple of marriages, for instance, and there is this shame that's associated with ending a marriage as though there was a failure. Like that word is talked about, or divorce is talked about as though it's the worst thing possible. And there's a lot of women in the United States, for instance, who feel like they got a new lease on life as a result of a divorce. And they shouldn't be carrying this weight of shame. And there's possibility for love again. And that I always think that somebody who is good for you, maybe in your 20s and your 30s, might not necessarily be the right person for you in your 40s and 50s. And there doesn't have to be a shame in that. It really is just, there's a different trajectory. So I'm wondering if the fact that we live longer isn't part of it. And the people who don't like anything outside of it, do they feel threatened? Like if your neighbor is not in the same type of a relationship as you, why does it matter to you? Where's the threat?
Yeah. A couple of scholars have written on this idea of threat, right? And I think they're onto something in pointing out that being confronted with people who are openly exploring something that intrigues you or that reflects to you in a very obvious way the kinds of desires that you yourself either have experienced or you recognize you could experience, that can be quite confronting to people. And so there's often a kind of backlash and hostility against it as a way of just avoiding thinking about it, right? And I think this is what makes things like non-monogamy super interesting as a social phenomenon, is that non-monogamous people will come along and say, look, like, we're not doing anything interesting, right? You have multiple friends, you have the ability to love multiple people in your family. Over the course of your life, you might have many sequential exclusive relationships, right? That shows you have this capacity to kind of connect with and be intimate with multiple people. So we're doing nothing different. There's no kind of unique skills or capacities or deviations of human nature going on here, right? We're just kind of doing this out in the open right now. And I think, I don't know, I mean, that's confronting to lots of people. That kind of sense of confrontation is tied up with lots of other factors, right? So a lot of societies are quite hostile towards sexuality in general. So there's a sex negativity, right? That sexuality is seen as dangerous, something to be controlled or policed or pushed to the corners. A lot of societies aren't doing a lot to promote autonomy. They're not consent orientated. I mean, the UK doesn't really do anything to promote the autonomy of younger people, of children. It doesn't really do much to kind of anchor a kind of consent culture in other areas of life. So people feel able to, make choices for their children and be very kind of domineering as parents. That's seen as a good thing. And so these are kind of pervasive social attitudes, right? And so people that call them into question or kind of point out these tensions often provoke others, provoke these kind of confronting experiences. But you're right that, your other question about social change is really important here, right? And we can't think about relationships in the modern context without thinking of the social and material changes that we're going through. And you're right that we're living much longer. So we're kind of undergoing this kind of so-called sort of second demographic transition. We're living much longer. The family unit is changing. The way that we work changes. The way that we relate to geography is changing. People are often moving around. They're being more flexible. They're following jobs. This creates a kind of social context for intimacy that's very different to how things used to be. And it's kind of interesting actually thinking about the notion of failure and stigma after relationships ending and looking at historical attitudes towards remarriage, for example. So remarriage, has always been around, but it's usually after the death of a spouse, right? So in a context where people died much more frequently in a younger age, poor healthcare and so on, people often remarried, and it was a kind of economic social necessity to marry as a way of kind of securing property or a business or whatever. There wasn't kind of shame associated to that as such. it's this idea of romantic failure that's really interesting. And that becomes a social possibility because we think about relationships of things we're entering into on our own terms and we're dictating, pursuing purely for the benefits they bring us. So Anthony Giddens calls this the ideal of the pure relationship. Like we're only in this relationship because it's doing something, it's bringing us a kind of emotional satisfaction in and of itself. It's not for some other goal, right, in an ideal world. And so because these social changes happen, right, we haven't really adapted with them. And I think this is one of the points that I make in the book, which is that there's a kind of a lag between the norms and ideals that we kind of subscribe to, which we see in the romantic comedies, which we read about, which we kind of think about on the one hand, and the social reality on the other hand. And those two things are just drifting apart, right? They're totally pulling apart in a way that is having a big change on how people foster intimacy. And just to go briefly back to one of the things you said as well about the benefits of experiments and living, it just reminds me of the work of a legal scholar called Ronald Otter, which is probably, one of the best names in the business, right? He suggests that we can think about the benefits of permitting or affirming non-monogamy in public life in a variety of ways. One way is to think, well, it's, an expression of freedom, let people do what they want. He's got this massive book written within a kind of US legal framework, constitutional framework, exploring whether plural marriage should be made legal. He thinks it should be. Loads of arguments about this, some of them about freedom and autonomy and so on, others about legal consistency, all of this kind of stuff. In another paper, he's got a very simple argument, which is that, there might be distinct benefits to this way of life. And socially, we're not going to know about that until people do it, right? Like it's an idea that goes back to a strand of thinking in John Stuart Mill, which is that there's a social benefit to allowing people to pursue the kinds of life, unconventional kinds of life, as long as they're not really harming each other extensively. And we don't really know what that social benefit may be. It may be that these people turn out to be kind of intimate pioneers that help develop new forms of caring, new forms of domestic life, new legal frameworks, new contractual frameworks that we can all benefit from. It may be that they all fail hopelessly and we look back and think, well, that wasn't very helpful. But there's value in allowing that experimentation to happen. It's a view that I'm very sympathetic to, which is that, even if we don't endorse these things for ourselves or we think that they're not for us, there's definitely social value in allowing them to go ahead. And it's valuable not just for the people in those relationships. And I think that's something that people are becoming a lot more aware of now, which is that as we live longer, questions around care in particular are becoming more prescient. So in the UK, again, we have this kind of social care crisis. People are living much longer. It's unclear how they're going to be looked after in old age. It's unclear how families are going to function with multiple generations. And so these kind of questions are kind of not just about romantic intimacy or sex. They're questions about how do we sustain communities of care over time when there are different individuals involved. And this may involve really practical changes, right? So do we need legal change? So one example, a colleague of mine mentioned at a conference last year, which I'd never thought of, was just the difficulty of getting an intergenerational mortgage, a mortgage that, spans several generations that might be living together in a similar property. They were trying to live with grandparents of different families and younger generation and their children and trying to get a mortgage that would cover that. And they said only 2 lenders in the country made this possible. But these kind of situations where, there's a kind of untraditional arrangement of people trying to live together or have assets or draw up contracts are going to be so much more common just because of how we're living. So there's definitely social value in allowing people to explore these things, and then we all stand to benefit.
Rudy's the lawyer who deals in finance, so I'm curious what Rudy thinks about the multi-generational mortgage. Do we have anything like that in the US?
It's fascinating that you guys brought this up. I was literally talking about this the other day, but I was actually talking about how out here in California, and we've mentioned this actually, Gwen, on a few different podcast episodes, in particular the ones where we've talked about infrastructure and in legal changes. Out here in California, starting in like 2020, the state law made it blanket that you can build an ADU, an accessory dwelling unit, which is typically called the granny flat, right? And so like state law trumps all local law, which is a very rare thing. It's kind of like a local versus state tension. But basically, in every place in California, you're allowed to have ADUs. The concept here is because of affordable housing and because more and more parents are either moving in with their kids or, quite frankly, kids are moving back in with their parents. And then right after 2021, they expanded it to a junior ADU, which is an apartment within the house. So you can actually convert a room to like have its own bathroom and have its own. So I don't know about the mortgages yet, Gwen. That's a great question. I haven't heard of it yet. And I know some people in the mortgage industry. But one way in dealing with the affordable housing and in the multi-generational type of living situation is to have it legal for you to kind of reconfigure your home to allow for multiple families to live there. And quite frankly, that is one way to deal with the affordable housing crisis. But it brings up all kinds of very interesting questions, Luke, about romantic relationships, platonic relationship. What does the family look like in the future, right? It's really no longer just going to be the mom and the dad and the kids or whatever, or whoever plays the role of the mom or whoever plays the role of the dad. I mean, it's going to be uncles and aunts and friends and people that have decided to connect together in order to be able to afford housing, in order to be able to afford living longer. I mean, truly raising children, it does take a village. I mean, it just does. I mean, I know for a fact that it does because I've got two of my own, and Jesus, I wish I had a village. I mean, I grew up in a village. I had aunts and a grandmother coming in and out of the house, and it was a nice environment to grow up in, but that's atypical American families, at least in the past. But in the future, when you have these shifting attitudes, both towards polyamorous relationships, non-monogamous relationships, people moving in together for economic reasons, it's going to be fascinating. And boy, I can't wait to see the sitcoms on that one. Well, I mean, we
We're
can,
also
us three could
going
probably write one.
backwards. I mean, you're right. So I think there's a super interesting, with this kind of interesting social point where there's a real tension between our ideal of family and the increasing social realities that people are facing. But actually, those social realities, right, of more sort of intergenerational living that involves people that aren't kin, being part of a caring network. And this is just taking us backward. Like in the UK, we're going back to kind of medieval living, right? Like these kind of overlapping care networks, these kind of complicated situations. And it'll be really interesting to see what kind of legal and social provisions emerge to just accommodate the reality. So even though we don't like, some people might not like this, it's happening. And I think government will be kind of playing catch up with that. But this is a kind of idea that's been explored in philosophy by kind of philosophers at looking at what we do with marriage, right? So there's a kind of, amongst people that think, look, marriage needs changing in some way, there are kind of two camps, I suppose. One is we need to revise the marriage setup, make it more flexible. Other people say we just need to kind of get rid of it, right? Like it's just not fit for purpose anymore. So we've got kind of Elizabeth Brake's wonderful book called Minimal Marriage that's saying to accommodate these kind of complicated care networks or intergenerational things or relationships where people share a home, but they, some of them are romantically involved, but some of them aren't, right? We need to kind of be able to recognize the kind of functionally relevant kind of relationships that people stand in to each other. So like, are you a parent? Are you a dwelling cohabitant? Do you share financial responsibilities? And so marriage needs to be kind of a lot more flexible. Other people, maybe people like Claire Chambers, who just think it's not going to work. Like it's too complicated. It's unenforceable. The state needs to get out of the marriage business altogether. The state can maybe provide some protection for kind of owning property or standing as a parent to somebody. But beyond that, anything else is kind of up to people to do in their own time. It's symbolic. It has a social meaning, but it's not rewarded by the state. And these kind of debates are kind of ongoing. And we're at a time now where a lot of people are starting to think, well, how do we kind of work out what matters to us? And I think the more people think about that, the less the kind of traditional romantic norm holds up, because people know that it just doesn't work like that anymore. There's so many people in blended families or families where there's divorce or families where there are non-family members involved or romantic situations that are complicated, that we just know that we need something to be more flexible and adaptable. So I'm really interested to see where this goes in the next 10, 20 years. I think we're going to see change for sure.
One of the things that I think is interesting is that, of course, you also talk about monogamous relationships and that there's a sense of safety in the parameters of that as well. And so we've set up everything legally, socially in order to fit in that box. And I think that when there's a discussion about other types of romantic relationships that are possible, that somebody might think that one is disparaging the monogamous relationship, when actually that's a beautiful thing when there's this agreement and there's that agency and the guardrails and there's that safety in that. So opening up the discussion to other types of relationships isn't to disparage that one. But now that we're talking about the law and property and things like that, I'm realizing that, my goodness, we have our legal structure and financial structure set up so that you have to check one of these boxes. You have to fit into one of those boxes in order to exist well. And so what we're proposing, or what philosophers do, is they ask the question of, well, wait a minute, let's define this. Does it have to be this way? It just seems like there's so much of a morality tied into the notion of a monogamous relationship. Again, nothing problematic about a monogamous relationship, but there's so much morality tied into that, that if you go outside of that, you are a deviant or you are immoral or you can't grow up. Like people even talk about the Gen Z generation right now and being like, they're not getting married. They just can't grow up, when really they're like, hey, we can't afford anything. We're adults. It's not a failure of maturity. There's just a lot going on, and maybe that structure doesn't work right now. What do you think?
Some people would respond to that and say, why are we so defensive? Why are we always trying to placate people that worry about how we might want to live our intimate lives? Like, why are you presupposing that monogamy is the norm? Why is that the kind of starting point, the point of reference? And I think once you kind of see beyond that and you start focusing on things that matter to people, so connection, forms of commitment, forms of intimacy, forms of kind of understanding and openness, you sort of see that these kind of aspects of human interaction are visible in lots of different kinds of relationships. And there's a kind of wonderful diversity there that I think is really, really interesting, kind of theoretically interesting, but also just really wonderful. Like, I'm really glad that I live in a time when I'm becoming increasingly aware of the kind of varieties of human intimacy that exist. And I feel like, looking back at myself as a younger person, where these things were not talked about, I didn't know about any of this stuff at all. You just think, well, what a shame, what a kind of black and white, monochrome, intimate existence you had. And I think a lot of people in our generation have that experience, actually. And I think that people are becoming more tolerant to diversity, whether they sort of like it or not. They're kind of rubbing up against alternative forms of life. But I also think that over time, this idea of monogamy as a default will be kind of under challenge. And I was recently reading this really interesting book about straight culture called The Tragedy of Heterosexuality by Jane Ward. Really enjoyed reading that. And at the end of the book, she has this really interesting theoretical move, which is basically to say, instead of trying to challenge straightness, we double down on it, right? We sort of say, look, if you want to be straight, great, but like, take ownership of that. We should start asking people like, oh, when did you first know that you were straight? Like, what's being straight like for you? How does it add value to your life? The kind of questions that people might ask queer people, right? And kind of really ask them with a kind of sincerity. And the fact that people find that kind of funny or amusing or kind of ironic, whatever, brings out the fact that we never ask these questions. And people don't think of being heterosexual as a kind of identity to be explored or to be embraced or something that they decided to pursue or that adds meaning to their life in any way. And I think we could do the same with monogamy, actually. We can sort of say, oh, when did you first know that you were monogamous? Like, why does that add value? How's that working? And just shift the conversational dial a little bit to a position where people are kind of asked to take ownership of the intimate life that they're pursuing. It's something that you can think about. It's something that you can explore. It's something you might be ambivalent about, but it's something that shouldn't be kind of seen as background furniture. It's something to think about actively, just like any other kind of lifestyle might be thought about actively. So it's a kind of consistency there. And I think it's a subtle move, but it's one that has a lot of potential for impact, right? Which is like, there's nothing wrong with this, but like, what's it doing for you? What are the kind of pleasures you're getting out of it? And I think those conversations, actually, once you actually start having them with people in real life, you realize actually there's a lot of ambivalence around some of these things, these ideals, right? People are kind of aware that this is ideal of what a good relationship looks like, but hang on, my life is a bit different, or I feel different to that, or it hasn't always worked for me in the past, or I'm always breaking up and moving on and so on. So there's a kind of, on the one hand, people know that these ideals don't work for them, but there's a kind of reluctance to confront that fact. So I think we can do more to help each other kind of explore these things gently together.
I want to point out a quote that I really liked from your book. It's the unpredictable nature of deep improvisation is partly what makes romantic life intoxicating. And so I really enjoyed that one of the distinguishing traits wasn't that it said it was something like, it's not exactly like a goal setting type of interaction. It's unique. Romantic relationships are one where there's this continual flourishing. That one of the reasons that it's important to explore, if you will, or understand is because we grow with these interactions with other people, and that's partly what it means to live a good life. It feels very Socratic to me. You're going out to the polls and learning, like, to understand the truth of the oracle. Socrates had to engage with others in order to understand what his purpose in life was. And I thought that was really interesting. And again, I want to be very clear that for monogamous relationships, that there's a lot of depth and understanding in that as well. We're not disparaging that route, just saying like one of the reasons why it could be problematic to cut off different types of interaction is because the way in which people grow is through these types of interactions and exchanges. And that's partly what makes things so beautiful.
Yeah, that quotation is from a discussion of work by someone called Benjamin Bradley, who's sort of thinking about the nature of love and how that works. And it's a really quite rich paper. And for me, it crops up in the course of thinking about two very general attitudes towards romantic life, which I think are kind of visible in our culture. One, I think I call something like the individual attitude, which is this idea that like, I know who I am, I know what I want, and I want to find somebody who satisfies the desires that I have. It's kind of a compatibility orientated interaction. You know, I'm this person, these are the things I want. I'm on the dating apps, I'm swiping, I'm setting my filters, like looking for the person that's going to kind of meet that. And there's a kind of overlap and interplay with kind of ideals about consumerism and individuality and a kind of what some people call emotional individualism that resonate with that. But then there's a kind of what I'm arguing for is a more relational attitude towards romantic life, which I think we're also kind of aware of, which is that relationships have a habit of changing us. They shape our values. They introduce us to new things, new values. They open up new opportunities for desire. They alter our self-conception, our sense of personality. And so they're inherently very unpredictable. And I've always been kind of slightly wary of this emphasis on compatibility that you sometimes hear, right? Like, and I'm guilty for watching pretty much every like silly reality TV show about dating under the sun, right? And you see it there where people often have a very fixed sense of what they're looking for or the traits and values and desires that are kind of guiding their search. And you see this also in romantic comedies, which is the sort of they end at the point at which the relationship starts. And I'm interested in relating and relationality in the ways in which like actually interrelating with people has this kind of impact on us that we can't predict. We have to be open to that and appreciate that. That gives us a range of opportunities. It may be good, it may be bad, right? We don't know. But I think factoring that in at the beginning is really important. And for me, that's why the kind of this notion of agency matters. And you mentioned earlier, you asked me, what is agency? And I never answered. So we can maybe circle back to that. So again, that's quite a broad idea. But the thing I have in mind is a broad kind of bundle of practical abilities that we have to sustain intimacy in the way we'd like over time. So this might involve, you know, the abilities to communicate, the abilities to introspect and think about our desires, or to interact with someone sexually, or to set up a relationship, or whatever it might be. But they're kind of abilities, they're practical skills. You know, some philosophers might want to use virtue language, they're kind of virtues or traits. You know, some of them might be traits of character, some of them might be kind of interpersonal practices. They're things you need to be able to do reliably over time in order to continue being someone that can have intimate interactions. And for me, I guess I worry that this kind of individualist attitude to romantic life, focus on compatibility, the focus on desire kind of neglects the agential aspect of romantic life, which is like, it's all good having desires, right? But if you're not somebody who can actually do anything to bring them about or to sustain them, or if you're somebody that's going to be undone in being satisfied, right, because you have a desire which is really in tension with the kind of person you are or the society you live in, then what's the point of that, right? Like, so desire on its own is kind of useless. And so I'm really wanting to kind of shift the dial and emphasize the kind of agential doing aspect of being in an intimate connection with someone over time, and sort of thinking about the quality of that agency, thinking about its nature. So it's something I suggest that is shaped by other people. It's not that we arrive at the scene as kind of agents, like ready to get on with some acting, like these little romantic Napoleons, fully formed, striding ahead into the world and making things happen, right? Like, our actual capacities to act are shaped by other people in all kinds of ways, and they can be undone by other people. So our agency is fragile in the sense that the treatment we receive from other people can actually make it very hard for us to sustain the intimacy that we desire. And you see this, like people going through breakups, people dealing with past trauma or sexual assault or whatever. They're people who are trying to uncover the ability to have intimacy in the way that they like. And that grappling with the ability is separate to whatever desires they may have. And there's always that tension I think people are experiencing. And you see this when people are exploring non-monogamy. They may have lots of desires for openness and love and connection, and struggle with actually making this happen in real life because they feel very insecure, or they're struggling with jealousy, or they have concerns around kind of resentment or whatever it might be, which make it practically very difficult for them to do what they want. And I think if we ignore the agency side of things, just focus on desire or on the kind of value and good of different arrangements, people may end up kind of pursuing relationship types that don't work for them, or not taking steps to protect and nurture their ability to kind of be intimate over time.
This is a very real issue that's in the United States. It's a problem that people do not talk about that much. But one of the reasons why Luke, your work is so important in coming up with the definitions and understanding this flourishing and what romantic agency is so that we can say when something is not in that paradigm and is actually dangerous. And that issue in the United States, again, that people do not talk about that much, but in several states, it is legal for minors to get married. And you will have 13-year-old girls get married off to older men. The idea of this being any kind of a romantic endeavor is absolutely awful. So if we don't, because just by the things that you put forth as far as definitions, is that we've got with romantic agency, first of all, the agency isn't there, right? You've got a 13-year-old girl. So the agency isn't even there. And then also the notion of flourishing for her and also for somebody who is so much older is not exactly going to be flourishing. He is 20 years the senior. It's so important when we have these kinds of conversations so that we can also identify what doesn't fit. We're not, so that's, I think what's important is that when I'm like, well, wait, is it just subjective? Well, no, it's not. It's not subjective, but there are these guidelines that should be open enough for people who are free and enjoying their life and without any kind of harm involved to explore. Have to remove that harm factor. And then you can identify things that are trying to be labeled as normal and they're not.
I mean, the idea of agency is a kind of very broad term, right? So there's a lot of detail to be fleshed out. Like, what do you actually need to be a romantic agent? What does that involve? What does that look like? And that'll differ for different people. And it's also a notion that I understand is coming in degrees. You have more or less agency. I find that useful to think about. I think the case of minors is interesting because, at least in the UK, it's a society that's very hostile to children, right? So on the one hand, we have this kind of social discourse around protecting the innocent children, right? But in a sense, not really respecting or valuing their agency at all. I mean, we see this around at the moment. We're in an election campaign and some parties want to reduce the voting age. And there are philosophers that have argued this is really important because young people are able to understand, engage with these issues. They affect their generation often much more than older generations. They have a future stake in society, so they should be part of the political conversation. There's a lot of hostility to that. And these are questions about capacity and agency, right? Like, are these younger people able to engage with this stuff? And I think similar questions actually can be asked around sort of romantic life, relationship, education, school. And there's often this thought that like agency sort of kicks in at a certain age and it doesn't exist before that, which I think is slightly, I don't personally subscribe to that view. I think we can do more as a society to think about nurturing people's agency in general and to understand that comes in degrees and can be undermined in complicated ways. And a lot of contemporary philosophy actually in this field is kind of looking at the ways in which various social dynamics influence and impact agency. So I was reading some interesting stuff on this morning, actually, just coincidentally, of thinking about consent and sort of power and age gap, all of this kind of stuff, ways in which our abilities to do stuff can be undermined. But even in kind of non-problematic cases, so cases where there's sort of no egregious behavior or abuse or anything like that, we might find that our ability to pursue the romantic life that we want is just not there. And in the book, the kind of first chapter is kind of trying to describe and set out the modern dating context and the norms that structure that context. And maybe this is just the UK, I don't know, but like people are terrible at communicating. They're terrible at kind of interrogating and thinking about the norms that structure their society. And those norms and that kind of social context really shapes our character. And that's an interesting idea that's been explored really nicely by some feminist philosophers, particularly people thinking about virtue. So people like Lisa Tessman, they want to say, look, like oppressive social norms can actually shape the kinds of people we are, because some people will always have to be pushing up against or resisting or evading or kind of dealing with this kind of social hostility. And I guess one of the worries that we have is that the kind of process of dealing with all of this stuff actually doesn't equip us to flourish in the ways we'd like. And I guess one thought that I'm exploring in the book, and maybe want to keep exploring, is that our kind of contemporary romantic ideals, the rom-com ideals, the ideal of the happy ever after, of this kind of sort of domestic unit, they're so entrenched and we're so kind of pursuing them in ways that aren't really helping us flourish as we might want to. So like a kind of key strand of the book, and it's one that sounds really boring at first glance, is a kind of deep realism. It's about understanding your social context, understanding the ways the norms are working, but also understanding your character and the way in which your abilities to navigate challenging emotions, for example, or your abilities to communicate, your abilities to have an active imagination, that those abilities may be shaped by your social context and upbringing in a way that you don't like and in a way that's in tension with your desires. And one possible outcome is that you're in a tragic situation, right? That you want stuff you can't have, and it's not your fault because you're living in a society with these really constricting romantic norms and ideals. And then that raises loads of other questions like, how do we get out of it? Can we get out of it? Are we kind of stuck? And I think these are questions that crop up in the non-monogamous community because you see people who want to be more open, to have intimacy with other people, or at least to be open to that idea, but really struggle with that in practice, right, for a lot of entrenched reasons. And there's a lot of talk about unlearning or kind of unpicking and all of this. But yeah, grappling with that tension is one that we often don't want to confront or we don't want to do. And I think that a lot of kind of unhappy serial monogamy is kind of just sort of repeating the same thing, chasing after the same ideal that we kind of know in the back of our mind isn't really right for us. And so this idea of realism, I think, is super interesting because it could be incredibly non-traditional, the outcome. Like being realistic might mean that you realize that monogamous life isn't for you, that you actually are able to sustain multiple intimacies at once, or that you don't want to live in the same place that your romantic partner's living, right? That could be like being realistic, and that's actually really confronting.
I want to wrap up with this question. There's not a lot in the history of philosophy that has to do with emotions or romance. So what I would like to know, I mean, you mentioned John Stuart Mill. I think that his work on the subjection of women would really lay the foundation for, I mean, for a lot of these questions. Actually, it's not a romantic book at all. But as soon as you start talking about women as citizens and being capable of contributing, that does shift relationship dynamics because you start to get the seeds of removing the economic survival as the reason for marriage as soon as you allow women to be able to pursue and have the freedom for their abilities. Where else? So we mentioned John Stuart Mill, but since you're working on romantic agency, you're in philosophy. Where in the history of philosophy are you able to reach back or find some nuggets that kind of allowed for this to, in 2024, come to be?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I would kind of separate out. So you kind of bundled emotion and romantic life together. So I do think there's a lot of historical writing on the emotions, right? So, I mean, Aristotle is probably the kind of the locus for this, and a lot of thinking about virtue. That's the idea of a kind of a stable trait of character that allows you to act in the right way at the right time with the right feeling, right? That's really connected to this notion of emotion. And there's a kind of really thriving subdiscipline of philosophy of emotion at the moment, which, you know, I find really energizing and wonderful. And people returning to Aristotle, thinking about emotion, thinking about what emotions are. And there's sort of different theories of emotion. So other key players in that might be people like William James as an American philosopher, but people like Charles Darwin wrote heavily on the emotions, very influential figure. And of course, other philosophers thinking about passion, so Hume and Kant and others as well. I think the thing that you're right about is that there is comparatively less written on sort of romantic life as such. There's a lot written about love, and a lot that's written about love is often very, very distinct from any of the kind of practical messiness of actually being in a relationship with someone. I mean, you could do a whole lecture course, university, on the philosophy of love in history and sort of not get a sense that anyone's ever been in a kind of romantic relationship, right? Love is often portrayed as very impersonal. The classic text for that obviously would be Plato in the Symposium, this kind of portrayal of love as sort of almost a kind of ever ratcheting, more abstract orientation to kind of the good, right? And as you get more and more along the ladder of love, kind of people's individual properties and characteristics and distinctiveness and messiness kind of drops away. And that's hugely influential as a conception of what love is like. It ties in very nicely with some religious ideals that kind of gain traction. And I think there isn't a lot written in the history of philosophy on just like relating to people, what it's like to be in a kind of loving relationship, or at least of the romantic kind. You know, so there will be, you know, strands of thought that are thinking about kind of family, familial love, often within a moral context. In non-Western cultures as well, in particular, this kind of notion of sort of filial obligation is prevalent. But it's not until recently, I think, that the kind of messiness of actually being in a relationship where you love somebody, you're trying to be intimate, you're trying to kind of connect with them, communicate, sustain something of a kind of unity of some kind. That's something that people are really only turning to now. And in fact, I remember one of the reasons I got into this in the first place was just spending a lot of time reading philosophers from the sort of 70s, 80s, and 90s who write about love and commitment and exclusivity as if they'd just never been in a relationship. And similarly, philosophical descriptions of marriage as if people have never actually like had a marriage. And historically, of course, a lot of philosophers weren't married, or if they were, it was pretty clear that they didn't really like the person that they were married to. So yeah, it's a kind of interesting dilemma. And as somebody that puts together courses on this, you've got to think, well, how much do we want to get stuck into tradition? How useful is that? But I think that what we find in the philosophy tradition is that there's a lot of resources for thinking about emotion, thinking about character, thinking about the impact of social context on behavior, on acting well, and thinking about other sort of important ethical ideas. So ideas of agency, ideas of being autonomous, of the rights and responsibilities that might accompany certain kind of social roles or relationship ideas. All of that's there. So all these tools are there. But a lot of what modern philosophers are doing is kind of grabbing all of these tools and then saying, well, hang on, like these are useful tools, but like the kind of life that I'm living, or the kind of life that the people I know are living, is very, very different to what even someone like John Stuart Mill was living, but, let alone people like Immanuel Kant were living. So it's a frustrating topic. And if you're really interested in relationships in particular, the kind of messiness of it all, right, the real lifeness of it all, then reaching for a philosophy text on the history of the philosophy of love, with all of this talk of abstraction and whether love is to do with properties or it's an appraisal or bestowal, you might find that really disappointing, actually. You might find it kind of overly abstract, confusing, just kind of annoying. And I think it's only very recently that people are starting to grapple with the messiness of it all, which is where obviously all the fun lies, I think.
It reminds me of the beginning of Either Or, Kierkegaard's Either Or. I think the letter or the editor at the very bottom says something like, here are these 2 points of view. There has no conclusion. And he's just opening us up to that is actually what makes reading this worth it. Because in the history of philosophy, we want our answers, we want our conclusions. I think just as human beings, we need to know things. We don't like things to be unsettled, but romance kind of opens the door of this possibility of where you're going to go. And even when you start, you're gonna evolve in a different direction, and it can be quite beautiful. But we don't have an answer for you. We don't have a Pythagorean theorem for it. And so maybe that's why philosophers have stayed away from it, because it cannot yield that kind of answer. But it's also this huge part of human existence. It's huge.
Well,
I mean, it's why we do so much.
So you're right to mention Kierkegaard, and I should have mentioned them. So they would be somebody you might go to. But even people like Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, who are sort of good figures on messiness in general, I think, messiness of kind of moral life in general. Again, and though my biographical knowledge is weak here, but I don't think that they had major romantic relationships of the kind we think of today. And I think that it's interesting to try and connect the kind of philosophy, the kind of social context, because the kind of like close domestic, intimate, sexual, loving, committed, exclusive relationship that kind of preoccupies our imagination now is not really the kind of thing that a lot of these people were thinking about. So love would be a lot more abstract because you're loving God, or you're loving duty, or you're loving your neighbor or something. They may be married, but marriage was often a social necessity. Or what was actually interesting in the more ancient context was the tension between discussions of love and realities of marriage. I mean, Socrates, you mentioned, right, was famously quite mean to his wife, and a lot of discussions around love and kind of what we think of as intimacy occurred in contexts which were only available to men of a certain social class. It's a complicated one, and it requires a lot of careful unpacking. But yeah, the social change we've gone through means that the kinds of things I'm interested in are a product of their time, I suppose, just like the things that preoccupied Kant, who did write on marriage very famously, very disparaging of people that didn't have sex, who had sex when they weren't married, right, was a product of their time as well. But we can still be in conversation with each other. And I think this is one thing that is really interesting. And I see this with students, is that there is definite value and excitement in asking even very broad questions. We had these discussions in my own classes about the nature of love. Like, why do you love your partner? Like, why do you love your friend? Is it because of these properties that they have? Or what if those properties change, as they will do over time? Like, will you still love them? And these are kind of perennial questions which still animate people, and they still perplex us. I was always frustrated by the fact that you could answer those questions and still not really know how to kind of interact or engage with people in the kind of process of relating. And I think you mentioned that a bit earlier when reading out that quote about this kind of improvisation, this kind of ongoing quality, but it's that relatedness aspect, which I think is often absent from the history of philosophy. And that's what people nowadays are kind of trying to put back into the picture. And I should say that this is going on in other areas of philosophy too. So a lot of feminist philosophers are thinking about agency and autonomy in ways that are deeply relational. They're pushing back against the picture of moral beings, as kind of individuals atomistically separated out from each other, who are just kind of making decisions and acting. That idea has lots of kind of important exponents. People like Iris Murdoch and more contemporary scholars are pushing at that. So loads of interesting stuff out there, lots of things to read, but it's also a great time to be studying the emotions, relationships, sexuality and intimacy. And I'm really happy to have lots of great colleagues doing good work in that field.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. It was a really interesting discussion. I know I was just listening in, but you guys had such great banter, and nobody wants to hear my thoughts on romance and stuff like that.
Good is in the Details is produced by Dr. Gwendolyn Dolske and Rudy Salo. If you're enjoying this show, please share it with a friend. Tag us on social media, Instagram, Good is in the Details Pod, or on TikTok at Prof. Dolske. If you would like extra content, you can go to our Patreon, patreon.com/goodisinthedetails. We have a book club, we've opened up a shop, and you can get a shout out from us on the pod. We're also on Facebook, Good is in the Details Pod. And remember to like, subscribe, follow, all the things to support the show. Check out the links in the show notes. And we'd also like to thank our sponsor for this episode, AvonmoreInc.com. It's that small bridge business that started in the 90s that became a global sensation amongst bridge players. So if you play bridge, or if anybody you know plays bridge, this is the perfect gift. Go to AvonmoreInc.com. They have everything for your next bridge party. Coasters, tallies, and smart playing cards, which are also great for kids. And when you go to AvonmoreInc.com, let them know Good is in the Details sent you. Okay, until next time, bye.